Well, hello everyone. Welcome to the first episode of the SDG Acceleration Series. I'm your host, Dr. Todd Jenkins, the founder and CEO of Bowtie Leadership and Development Incorporated, a global leadership management training and coaching firm. I am also a senior advisor at TerraScale. The United Nations Sustainable Developmental Goals are a call to action to end poverty and inequity, equality, protect the planet, as well as to ensure that all people enjoy health, justice, and prosperity. During this series, we are speaking with experts who are leading the charge to achieve these goals. I am honored to be joined today by Lieutenant General Russel Honore, a Louisiana native and highly decorated 37-year, Army veteran, a global authority on leadership and an expert on climate change and a disaster preparedness. So we're going to be speaking about his decades of leadership as well as his personal fight to protect the environment with a focus on SDGs 9, 10, 11, and 13 today. So without further ado, General Honore, how are you doing?
Good morning, Doc. How are you today?
I'm doing well. It's really great to have this conversation with you. I'm honored. I think we should just jump right in. I want to start with your career because you had a long career that's taken you all over the world. Tell the audience a little bit more about your background and your experience and how you show up today.
Well, I guess it started on a small subsistence farm in Lakeland, Louisiana. Segregated Lakeland, Louisiana. I was born in 1947, actually during a hurricane on September 15, 1947, and grew up on that farm in a family of 12, where everybody contributed to the subsistence of the family. And we understood if you want something, you got to work for it. And the harder you work, the luckier you get, and the more opportunities come to you. And upon finishing high school, I went to Southern University, A&M College, HBCU in Baton Rouge, but I studied agriculture because my heart was to be a farmer. But while at Southern, I joined ROTC. It was mandatory at the time I joined. And I graduated as a second lieutenant with a 4-year obligation to the Army, and what started off as an obligation ended up with a 37-year way of life. We raised 4 children, we moved 25 times, and I spent 11 years on and off overseas in that 37 years. So I'm committed to the American team. I've seen a lot of places around the world, and I do think we have a special place in the United States to live some of those charter issues that were raised by the UN to ensure equity, ensure that we take care of our planet, we don't overheat it, and that we take care of those who in need. Everybody should has a human right to clean air, clean water, safe land, and food. That's a human right of every human on this earth. And under the UN Charter, we value everyone. So that 37 years in the Army, I got to see a lot of places, go a lot of places. Got to see the good, the bad, and the ugly. Some of it we created, some of it we solved, but we're still a work in progress. And we got much work to do with the coming on the horizon, the predicted catastrophic event of global warming, and that we need to really do something by 2030, or we're going to really start seeing some of the predicted downfalls of a warming Earth, just as we witnessed in Mississippi this past weekend, repeated tornadoes, floods, droughts, all of them getting worse, to include the West Coast of the United States that's went through a horrific weather pattern. There's more bad news to come there as a result of these changing climate conditions as a result of global warming. So that's how I got here. And when I came back to Louisiana, I had to do something besides between breakfast and lunch, other than decide where I was going to lunch. So I got involved in fighting pollution. And I created an organization called the Green Army. And our mission is to find solutions for pollution.
So, that's an incredible journey, and I definitely would like to hear more about that Green Army. Really thinking back to your upbringing from a farm. Now lieutenant, retired general. You're one of 12 children. I'm one of 13, so I can understand what that life is like. But you had some incredible accomplishment, and one of the ones that's really well known is your efforts helping in response to Hurricane Katrina. And I'm just really curious, that experience alone, it was such pivotal in a lot of things that we are doing today in our response. And I'm curious, from your perspective, how has that really colored your lens to how you show up today in all these numerous disasters, and really been called to the table to give your perspective and feedback? How has that experience with Hurricane Katrina helped you develop a lens today, or do you feel as if we taking steps back? Are we getting better? Curious on your perspective.
Well, Hurricane Katrina was a natural disaster. And it reminded us that anything built by man can be destroyed by Mother Nature. But what it also exposed was the man-made disasters that were happening in Gulf Coast, Louisiana, and in the Gulf of Mexico. And the most relevant point I can share with you is I arrived in New Orleans on Wednesday. The storm hit Monday. I arrived in New Orleans on Wednesday, and I took a Navy helicopter out in the Gulf to go out to the USS Baton, which was floating in the Gulf with some helicopters on it, and to coordinate with the captain of that ship. And as we were flying out, I saw these black streaks in the water, and I asked the pilot, I said, "What is that?" And the pilot said, "General, that's probably abandoned oil wells that have been blown over by the hurricane." I knew the mission in New Orleans would take days or maybe a week to evacuate the people. But a thought came to mind: how in the hell did we let this happen? Because that oil wasn't going away. It would forever have an impact on the Gulf, and it has. And it showed the vulnerability about aquatic ecosystem and wildlife along the Gulf of Mexico that were destroyed as a result of that storm, because it unleashed abandoned oil wells and pipelines. And over the years, I've come to learn that the federal government does not require most of them international companies, when they complete drilling in the Gulf, make them clean up and take away the old wells, nor do they require them to take up the old pipelines. And those things will continue to spew oil in the Gulf, which pollutes the Gulf. And we don't have a right as a generation to say we're going to allow the Gulf of Mexico to be polluted. And we need to take stock of a fact point. Since 1973, over 50% of the world's wildlife has been destroyed by man. That's another man-made disaster. So while Katrina was a natural disaster, and they will continue to come, storms and floods more frequently as a result of climate change, what it exposed us to, the winds and the floods, is the pollution that sits around these 150 chemical plants between Baton Rouge and New Orleans, and the hundreds of abandoned oil wells in the Gulf. That's man-made disaster. And it's happening in plain sight, and some of that damage is permanent. We'll never turn it around. So that excited me to get involved with and create the Green Army to help find solutions for pollution. We've done it before. There was a day you could fly into Los Angeles and you couldn't see the ground because of something called smog. and we put catalytic converters on cars. Now you can fly into LA on a clear day and actually see the city when you fly there. So we have made improvements, but we got a lot more improvements to do if we're going to even put the brakes on what's coming up in 2030 and 2050 with consequences of global warming.
Yeah, and that, General, you talked about vulnerability and these natural versus man-made disasters. And it's, we have to always remind ourselves, and we should wake up every day and be grateful that Mother Nature allowed for us to operate society. And I think we forget that because of business priorities and greed, et cetera. But when we think about the America's infrastructure, just how vulnerable do you think we are related to climate change? And what are some of the things that we need to do to future-proof ourselves for what's to come in that 2030 and 2050?
Well, the Corps of Engineers and the Weather Service have used categories: the 100-year flood, the 200-year flood, the 500-year flood. And it gets us into a category of saying, historically, we're going to get one of these floods every 100 years. But with the impact of climate change, we're getting a 100-year flood every 2 or 3 years.
Right.
Which was at one time a natural disaster. They're now becoming a man-made disaster because we're warming the earth up to a point where it's creating these large storms that's bringing a tremendous amount of moisture in to the West Coast. And what start off in the West Coast as rain and snow comes across the country. And by the time you get to the Midwest, it's a train of tornadoes or flooding. And if you had a storm or a flood every 100 years, that's almost 2 generations of people who have said, boy, it's nice to have a house down here by the river. Or it's nice to live on the eastern shore of the United States. Well, you might go 100 years in the natural progression. When you look at over 25% of America lives near water, it brings one to think where we live. Because each year, more and more people are moving close to water. My advice to friends is, I would not necessarily go and seek property on beachfront property because you could have in your lifetime 2 or 3 100-year storms that'll come in and destroy your property. I would be very conscious of buying a house on Bayou Road because it's probably gonna flood. The same is be conscious of the fact of buying a house on River Road. It's high probability you're gonna flood because that's what rivers do. When floods come, they run over their banks, even if they have levees. So for a period of time, we became comfortable in moving into a subdivision that says the reserve. Reserve for, why is it a reserve? Well, it never was developed. Well, there's probably a good reason why the Native Americans never hung around there too long. They'd go there and fish and hunt and leave. Now we building mega mansions in them. And when they flood, you say, how did this happen? Well, you built in a swamp, you built in wetlands. And every day we lose more and more of our wetlands, which were a cushion, Doc, to the traditional older communities in America. We're moving more and more into the wetlands. And more people are being exposed. And people would tell me, say, well, General, that subdivision was created by the Planning and Zoning Board. That doesn't mean that the Planning and Zoning Board will approve a ham sandwich. All they're looking for is taxes. So we got more and more people unknowingly moving into the flood zone. And as it is, floods destroy more homes than any other event in the world. And over time, people have continued to expand housing in the valleys. The valleys are associated with great geological formation, much of it caused by rivers of water. And as I said, if you live next to the river, you can expect a flood. And that has been played out in history, but what is worse, natural disasters are going to happen. Mother Nature's coming. The frequency is more often because of global warming. But the human tragedy is planning and zoning boards approving homes in what is known as wetlands.
And see, in this economy, especially in the States, where this notion that arguably many would say that is profit over people instead of putting people first. And I'm really intrigued around the movement and the organization, the Green Army. I've been looking into it and reading into it, and it's amazing work that you've done to found that organization. But for any of our viewers who have never been able to really understand your vision beyond the Green Army, tell us a little bit more what really made you, like, what was that spark to say, this is what, I want to start, and this is the vision for it, and this is the impact that we're going to do to address these environmental issues. I know you started that in Louisiana, but I'm curious to see that global vision or just the vision you may have in the region. Tell us a little bit more.
Well, I started the Green Army around a disaster that happened in a place called Bayou Corn. It was a group of primarily Cajuns of Cajun descent and culture that were living around this bayou that sat on top of a salt dome. And a company from Texas with the address in a country club in north of Dallas came in here and drilled a well in the salt dome that was 1 mile by 2 miles. Took thousands of years of geological work by Mother Nature to create such a enormous structure. They came in, the state told them they were drilling in the wrong place. They got their lobbyists and their influence, and they continued to drill. Well, guess what happened? They broke the salt dome. And when they broke the salt dome, 50, 100-foot trees were sucked into the salt dome, changed the geological formation of that area. And there were about 125 homes in and around there. All those people had to move because the gases that were emanating from that salt dome. They got minimum money for their property, and they had to move. And those people called me after a year and said, hey, General, we need your voice. We saw what you did in Katrina. They're not listening to us. And Louisiana is a red state. And most of those people at Bayou Corn were Tea Party members. But the government wasn't paying any attention to them. The governor was a big affiliate with the Tea Party, and as far as conservative thought. But he paid no attention to the people because he was taking donations from the very company that ran the salt dome. So I went to meet the people, and within 2 weeks, we had a major news conference in Baton Rouge and started to get the local media engaged and national media to pay attention. Many of them came in and did live reports on the impact. And this was back during the Obama administration. We got minimum help from the EPA because the EPA said it's up to the state to enforce the Clean Air and Clean Water Act. So the people were left hanging. And from then, I went to a conference in New Orleans at Xavier University. And as I was walking out, had been talking about the impact of pollution in Louisiana, and someone yelled out, General, you ought to create the Green Army. And that's where the name came from, not from some big research or focus group. It came from a shout out. And we stuck with that, and we still use it today. And when I created it's a coalition of about 25 different activist groups in and along the bayou and points north in Louisiana. I got advised by my fellow members that we needed to create a big office in Baton Rouge and get a secretary, get a lawyer, get lobbyists. And I said, you know what, that would be a conventional army. I think we need a guerrilla army. Because when you build all that infrastructure, you got to feed that beast. And I've got to spend a whole lot of time raising money. Then when you raise money, people can tell you what you can and can't say. However, we create a guerrilla army. From what we learned in fighting counterterrorism over the last 20 years, it's the idea that's important. That everybody can act where they are independently in finding solutions for pollution. We're not saying you can't use a product. We're saying that product cannot have an impact on global warming. That product cannot have an impact on the fence line communities that live next to it. That product, when it wastewater come out, it can't go into bayous and streams and rivers and pollute the drinking water or the water that go into the estuaries where our seafood give birth or hatch. That is the issue we're dealing with. So the idea behind the guerrilla army is about the idea. It's not about the structure.
I love that. You know, one of the things that's very, fascinating also about the Green Army, it's a movement, and the solution for pollution. And speaking of research, we are starting to see more and more evidence, even though it was linked early in the civil rights movement. But a study that was just recently published around the inequities and the inequality that is intersected with the environmental. And I know it's been several, small movements around environmental social justice or environmental justice. But I wanted to get your perspective on that intersection between inequality, inequity, and climate change, and your view on what you have seen over the years.
Well, a lot of development in Louisiana is along the river, because the river is a source of transportation. You bring in raw products in like natural gas, you turn it into fertilizer, plastic, or enabling chemicals that are used, everything to make this telephone or to make this, paint this cup. Much of it has its DNA along the river between Baton Rouge and New Orleans. And they literally bought tracts of old plantations. The difference between now and 125 years ago when those plantations were active, or 150 years ago when they were active with slaves on them, is back in the day, the plantation owner lived on the plantation. Today, most of these plants are foreign owned. And if they do have a local manager, they probably live in New Orleans, in upscale New Orleans, in $2 million homes. But they're doing the same thing. They go into the parishes and parts of the parishes that have the least say in the government, which is normally the poor and Black communities. And they said, well, we're rezoning this heavy industrial. And oh, by the way, it's going to bring jobs. Well, guess what? The jobs never come, but they bring pollution. They bring noise. They bring runoff from the plants that destroy the local areas where people fish and hunt as a way of subsistence or just for recreation. And I can tell you, I haven't known of a plant that's built anywhere near a majority subdivision. In other words, a subdivision where the majority live. of people, the brick houses with the mini mansions. The plants don't go to that part of the parish. They go to the part of the parish where the descendants of slaves still live in modest, small homes, many times on one road in and one road out. The descendants still live there. And that's where the plants go.
And I think, you're hitting, and that's been very evident in many communities, and it continues to grow. The disparities continue to grow time after time because, due to the shortage in the plant, you have, immigrants movement, and then it continued to the poor get poorer because it's not sustainable wages or livable wages. And so we continue to see this oppression continue to be systematic and systemic. And so when we think about the terms of zoning and land use issues, do you think it's possible for us to, advocate at the federal level to oversee these environmental issues related to building? Or should this be more of a regional conversation with stakeholders? Because, everybody's trying to buy land, everyone is trying to make profit over people. But it's also another conversation of, should we have these zone and land use agreements, with some regulation? So I was curious from your perspective of, what level should that advocacy come from, or should it be all the above?
Well, the federal government is starting to dip its power in that under this administration, in that they're forcing the states that issue permits to determine if this permit will have an inverse impact on a community, underserved community. In other words, a minority community. So the conversation is there. And the EPA right now is suing the state of Louisiana because there's information that showed that the state has not taken into account the impact on the poor fence line communities. And matter of fact, the states have gone along with the parishes who say, we want this plant, this is where we want it to go. And oh, by the way, it just happened to be in a Black community or a concentration of poor people. That's where the plants are going. It's not going next to the big subdivision or the country clubs. It's going out in those parts of the parish. Now we got to understand that what is done in these 150 chemical plants feed the industrial base around the world. And as we go from 7 to 10 billion people, more people are going to want phones. More people are going to want these coffee cups. More people are going to want these water bottles that we throw away. All of that has some DNA to the petrochemical industry between Baton Rouge and New Orleans and over into the Houston Ship Channel. So we're a sacrifice zone. The last administration called us the chemical corridor. Now, who in the hell want to live in the chemical corridor where your life expectancy is 10 years less than the rest of America? And poor children have 7 times more asthma than other kids around the country. And where our prenatal birth rate, death rate exceeds that of much of Africa. And that happens mostly to poor people and people of color. The prenatal birth death rate is less in Cuba than it is in Louisiana. Because of that impact, and at the same time, our politicians try to say it's our diet that's causing it. It's not any impact from the chemicals, it's our diet, while we live 10 years less. But we know better, and we're getting better and better data coming out of Tulane and some parts of LSU, where we can show them there's a direct relationship between the chemicals in these plants and life expectancy in Louisiana.
Yeah, thinking about the responsibility and who's responsible, right? We're starting to see many organizations, many companies and corporations creating social responsibilities team, corporate responsibility team, ESG teams for environmental social governance. And I know there's a quote from another interview where you describe what you call a evolution to stupid in terms of corporations doing things that are bad for people's health and the environment. What incentives or regulations need to be in place to kind of change or transform the corporate behavior? And what role do you think they should play in this?
Well, I'll give you an example. The LNG, liquefied natural gas, that became a topic on the nightly news after the war in Ukraine started. And what was going to happen to Europe, the EU, when Russia pipeline broke and they couldn't get natural gas to Europe. So many people got into this, oh, well, the United States can produce more LNG, liquefied natural gas. Now, liquefied natural gas is a derivative of natural gas, the same type that might be coming into your home to heat and that you use on your stove. We're all familiar with it. Well, we did have a natural gas boom in Louisiana because of fracking. It exacerbated when in 2014, then President Obama got hoodwinked into approving the sale of U.S. energy. Up until 2014, the U.S. policy was we would not sell our oil and gas. We would buy it, but we won't sell it. And they convinced President Obama to allow us to start selling oil and gas on the open market. Thus was born the LNG business. So they flow in as natural gas to the Gulf, primarily in Louisiana and Texas, and get converted to liquefied natural gas. In that conversion, they cool it, they scrub it, and they take the methane off by burning it. And as you know, methane is the most dangerous of all the greenhouse gas. And they're burning tons of it day and night to produce this LNG. They put it in tankers and ship it overseas, and it's sold on a global market rate. And as the global market requires more energy, they're buying it, they're writing 25-year contracts with these companies in Louisiana. But the price change based on the global market, when the price of LNG goes up on the global market, so does the natural gas price in Louisiana. So here I am, minding my own business. We get a cold snap in December, and I see my natural gas price double. Because somebody is taking our natural gas, turning it into LNG, and selling it overseas, much of it going to Asia. And it's a backward-ass process. When Speaker Pelosi was in Taiwan to advance the concept of we support Taiwan and support the democratic process, China encircled Taiwan with ships and airplanes. That same week, China signed a 25-year contract with a company in Louisiana to sell them LNG. How in the hell could that happen? And the LNG plants are approved by FERC. That is a board created and appointed by the president. So they're approving LNG plants, and we don't use LNG in America. It's strictly for sale. And when we sell LNG, it drives up our natural gas price. It drives up the price we pay for fertilizer. 2 years ago, I could buy a ton of fertilizer for my horse pasture for $500. Last year was $1,000. 2 weeks ago, it was $800. Because the price of natural gas went up because LNG went up. And when the price of LNG go up, so does natural gas. And it's causing a big part of the inflation in America because it costs the farmer more to raise the corn. It costs the truck driver more to buy the diesel. It costs the truck driver more to buy tires. And I think it's one of the underpinnings of the inflation we see today because some Wall Street investors, former member of the Bush and Obama administration, came up with this bullshit plan to sell LNG. None of them had been in the oil and gas business, but they saw an opportunity to pull this syndicate together and then made a lot of money selling liquefied natural gas, which is made from natural gas, which is something in most of our homes. And regardless of what we do, our lives are influenced by natural gas.
And see, so we have, thinking about that and ensuring that we are informed and aware, because, the federal government has all these organizations, just as one of our responders or participants just acknowledged, DOE, HUD, DOT, NPS, et cetera. But, even the participant and shared in commentary, they don't see them, fulfilling their promise or their responsibility. So, when it comes to this level of engagement, awareness of how we can do better from these federal government initiatives and what our tax dollars are paying for, where is the opportunity? Well, I mean, we're in a really, really interesting, probably divisive topic and conversation that some people argue say they don't care about the environment, or should you call it the environment or climate change. And I've seen in research, someone who studies social psychology, is that belief system, your belief will trump the facts. So we can hear the facts all day, but if I don't have the attitude or the belief that this is something that I, as a citizen and as a human, should care about, how do I expect for these agencies to be able to thrive or even trust the government around this issue? What advice do you have for us all to kind of move forward? Because we know that, these goals, we're not on track to hit these goals for the UN.
Well, Doctrine is exacerbated by the good intentions of carbon credit. When Japan received that LNG from Louisiana, where we sucked down all the pollution from it, and from the wellhead to the plant that turns it into LNG and we ship it overseas, Japan applied for carbon credits because it said, hey, we're using clean energy. We're not using coal, so we capturing carbon credit. What a concept. In Louisiana, our previous governor gave a EU consortium a 10-year tax break to build a plant that hired a couple dozen people. And their job is to collect trees in Louisiana, turn them into wood chips, pellets, look like dog food, put them in a ship in Baton Rouge, ship them to the EU. They get to England, they burn it for heat, and they get carbon credits because it said the wood is biofuels. It's sustainable, it's renewable. So they're getting carbon credits. Can you believe that bullshit? You're cutting down our trees, which are key to our environmental health, right?
Right.
You're shipping it on a train that uses diesel to get it to the port. You put it on a ship that's using dirty oil. You ship it to Europe, and the EU can sit back having tea at 3 p.m. and said, we got some carbon credit today. We're using bio-sustainable energy. That's bullshit. It's not biosustainable energy, and they're getting tax credit for it. That's the sad thing about it, because it's sustainable in that we can grow more trees. Well, if it's so popular, why don't you cut your own damn trees down and create your own wood? But they're doing it here in America. Excuse me. Sorry about that.
I know, take your time.
But they're doing it here in America. And we let them get away with it because we will not do anything about climate change until we have a change in the Senate.
Mm.
We can talk about it, we can cry about it, we can scream about it. Nothing will happen until those people in the Senate have a different attitude about protecting our air, our water, and our land. And right now, until the people my age and that class retire or whatever happens over time, there will be no change. Because every president going back to Bush 1 and 2, with the exception of the last president, has addressed something to do with global warming. Going back to Kyoto, to you name them all, COP 20s on up to where we are now, all attempted to do something to sign on to reducing global warming, as I said, with the exception of the last one, former president. And it dies in the Senate. The president will sign a decree, they leave office, then the next president throw it in the trash can. Or it goes to the Congress for action, it might come out the House. But every good idea we've had about dealing with global warming and climate change dies in the United States Senate, because the people in the Senate are controlled by the big lobbyists that work for big oil and gas. And they see transitioning from oil and gas as a threat to their business, as opposed to encouraging them to make the transition to sources of energy that do not warm the earth. Their defense is, well, China create more than us, so we ain't gonna cut back if China's still going. So it's like the drunk next door. I'm not gonna stop drinking because my neighbor's still drinking. He drank more than me, so I'm gonna still be drinking. And both of you are killing yourself. But what's the success in China? They have days there where they tell people stay home, because they've sacrificed industrial development over quality of life in China. They got days where they tell people stay home in Beijing. We don't have that in America, but our government in the Senate have said, hey, well, until China and India cut back, we ought not cut back. We haven't done that with other things. That's just not the American way. But it shows the impact from the political side of uncontrolled amount of donations from the lobbying groups, such as the oil and gas industry, and also when we get the other social scrunch, we got the impact of guns from the NRA, and they control America through the Senate.
So advice to my generation, and then to my kid who's turning 3, what hope do we have? And of course I've been involved with these conversations since I was a little boy as well, but still yet we're still having the same conversation, the same dialogue. And do you feel as if we have any power as the public to demand to help accelerate these these UN or the SDG goals? And then what will you say to us as the next generation? What do we need to do to continue to hold our officials and the politicians accountable and then also you got to talk to 2 ends. What about individuals who don't have that social capital and the power to influence, and then the others who have a voice and they have a vote. What will you say to us? What is your advice to us to keep hope and keep this conversation and movement going forward?
Well, to put it in context and perspective, every generation has had a big war to fight. It started off in the Revolutionary War when our ancestors fought the British and won our freedom, per se, because 20% of Washington's army was slaves. And then when we won our freedom from the British, the powers that be said, "Oh, not so fast. You black people, yeah, y'all fought and stuff, but not so fast." You know what I mean? And then we move forward, another 100 years, and we go to the Civil War. We fight a war over slavery. That generation fought a war. We came out of the Civil War. The next big war was World War I, where we sent young men from around the country of Army age, 18 to 20-year-old, were told to report to the recruiting station. They put them on trains and they shipped them to training bases and trained them for World War I. And we did that during the pandemic. And the president at the time didn't tell the people the pandemic was happening. He focused on the war in Europe. And we deployed troops out of places like Fort Riley, Kansas, where many of those troops died en route to Europe from the flu. They call it the Spanish flu. Mm-hmm. Not because the flu started in Spain, but Spain reported it, and then everybody called it the Spanish flu. But thousands of those young men we sent to fight in the trenches in World War I died from flu, influenza. The war was over, they came back home. We had the Depression some 30-some years later, we didn't get the war, the end all wars, World War I, done right, and we had to go back to World War II to take on the fascist Nazi regime that wanted to conquer the world and exterminate the Jews and any minorities. So we finally got pulled into that war and got decisively engaged after Pearl Harbor. And again, the buses and trains showed up in small towns and big villages and metropolitan and carried these young men and women this time off to fight World War I. And in one day in the battle, D-Day invasion, 9,000 casualties in one day. Many of them were underage. Because they were coming out of depression, they left the poor farms and slums of America, lied about their age, went in the army, and died on the beaches of Normandy. Many of them under 18, never to touch their mother's hand again or to cuddle with a girlfriend. They died as they came out of the boats at the beaches of Normandy. 9,000 in one battle that day. We finished that war, again with the intent, the war to end all wars, World War II. And all we asked the people of Europe was, we don't want this beach. We don't want your paintings. We don't want your fine art. We just want a place to bury our dead. And that's what we did in Holland and England and France. You go there now, and there are thousands of Americans that never made it home. I say this to tell you that every generation has a war to fight. When I was coming out of high school, the buses were lined up with draft notices to go to Vietnam to stop what we call the domino theory of countries fall into communism. And most of our listeners are astute enough to know how that war ended. I say that to mention these wars, that every generation got a war to fight. I think your generation don't have to worry about going to a World War III. Your generation has a war to fight, but the war is fighting to save Mother Earth. That's your war. During the Vietnam War, we saw the power of young people getting on the street and said, no more war, peace. It's going to take this kind of movement from the young people to say, stop polluting. But to tell the young people of this generation, like the young people in the anti-war movement during Vietnam, the young people stopped that war because the Senate and those in power were just as happy to keep it going because it wasn't their kids dying. You with me?
Yes.
Rich kids got deferments to go to college. And that war was fought when McNamara recruited the 100,000, is what they call them. 40% of them were African Americans that only had 10% of the US population, but 40% of those drafted to go to Vietnam in McNamara's 100,000 were African Americans, mostly poor young men from the poor parts of town and farms and villages across America. So we saw the ugly truth of that. But the point being made, Doc, is every generation has a war to fight. Yours will not be getting on a train, getting on a bus, getting on a plane, going to Fort Benning to learn how to be an infantryman. We have a volunteer army now. But what is the calling for your generation? Is to speak out and push back on the things that's causing global warming. Right now, in local governments throughout Louisiana and throughout the South, you got county and parish governments that are saying, hey, we don't want solar panels in our parish because we don't like the way they look. That has nothing to do because they're covering up what was a sugarcane field. The reason they're doing that is that the oil and gas people are giving money to the parish council people to run for office, and they're feeding this idea, just like the cigarette companies did when we were fighting them, that you don't want these solar panels. They're gonna make your place look ugly. Stay with sugarcane. The problem is sugarcane is subsidized by the federal government, about $50 billion a year. It's a subsidized crop. If we create our own energy from it, the solar panels, to run a plant or to run a school or to run a subdivision, we're not using fossil fuel, which eliminates the amount of global warming that's happening. But we are getting fights every day at the local level, fighting against sustainable transitional energy, whether it's solar or whether it's wind power. We're getting pushback from local governments on advancing technologies that might reduce our carbon footprint. Because at the end of the day, Doc, we're all a part of this. As we approach Earth Week, I encourage all our listeners, plant a tree. Commit yourselves to say stuff. I will not use styrofoam. I will not water my lawn. I'll water my trees and shrubs, but I will not water my lawn. We use more water watering lawns than we do watering corn in America. What's wrong with that stupid picture? And then we pay somebody to come fertilize it, and the fertilizer run off into the river. How stupid is that?
In general, it's interesting. And I'm just so glad that you equipped us, just with these practical things, like, going into Earth Week and what our generation can do, and reminding us that we have to first own I think first we have to be aware that we are in the water fight, and what is really that fight. And then we also then got to, put on our armor and step up to the plate and ensure that our voices are heard and the movement is there, and continue to move forward. One of my final questions that I have for you before we get ready to wrap up is that, it's not typical to see a general in the sustainability effort. So, well, someone as profound as yourself, and as well as the opportunity to, you're the chairman and advisory board on the chairman of the other advisory board of TerraScale. What do you see today about, been working with the company in terms of sustainability efforts, or even your lens as a general in this work?
Well, we can do better. We can build sustainable communities where we recycle water, where we reduce our carbon footprint, where we optimize geothermal energy from the earth, as opposed to burning fossil fuel and releasing greenhouse gases. We can better insulate buildings. All the crying in Europe, or when the Ukraine war started, they have no standards in Europe for insulating their homes. 25% of Europe's energy is lost in their ceilings because their homes are not properly insulated. So that's a 25% saving right there if they insulated their homes properly. All of us, why take a 5 or 6 minute shower when you can take a 3-minute shower? We all can be cognizant of that. We all can use reusable cups, as opposed to these bottles. This bottle of water in the airport will cost you $5. Who would have thought we'd be paying $5 for a damn bottle of water? We can all make a difference. And right next to that place you're buying that $5 water, if you had a reusable cup, you could draw the water out and drink it. Right. But we have erred on the side of convenience. There is still a place for plastic water bottles, don't get me wrong. Right now in Mississippi, the tornado took the water system out. So the only way we can get water to those people now is to optimizing bottled water. But we can do better and have on-site machines that can recycle those bottles, as opposed to just throwing them in the dump. We can do better. And as we go into Earth Week, we'll be pushing an initiative from the Green Army. If your politician does not believe in climate change, don't vote for him. Plant a tree. Don't water your lawns. Water your shrubs. Don't use styrofoam. If you can walk, don't ride. Reduce your carbon footprint. And get activated in what's going on in your community when it comes to what we're doing about global warming. Don't elect officials that says, well, it's just the weather. It ain't got nothing to do with man. Nobody wait China. What are you gonna do about China? If we don't do something about ourselves, trust me, China not gonna do anything either. Because they're at the same risk. They got 1.3 billion people to feed, and they can't feed them. Their food security is not sustainable. They have to trade with the rest of the world to feed 1.3 billion people. And the same thing with India. Let's do us. Let's be an example of the world of not only democracy, but an example for the rest of the world for ESG and for getting our corporate entities to do something about reducing the impact of greenhouse gases, and let's help save our drinking water. Only 1% of the Earth's water is drinkable. Now, get this, Doc. We got less clean drinking water today than we had yesterday. And the sad part about it, we'll have less clean drinking water tomorrow than we got today. Think about that.
Wow. Wow.
So that's why I'll leave it. And that's my story. And I'm sticking to it. Let's find solutions to pollution.
I love it. Thank you, General, so much. But most importantly, thank you for your service. Thank you for your leadership in this space. It's a pleasure to be on the advisory board with you at TerraScale. And it was so great for a lot of individuals to hear your perspective today. Do better, be the solution for the pollution. And on that note, I want to thank you all for joining us today. It's been such a fantastic opportunity to engage with General. And for those that have listened to this and been inspired, feel free to join and follow General Honore on Twitter at LTGR Russel Honore Twitter. That's a great way to follow him and learn all about the Green Army. You can follow me on social media outlets at Dr. Bowtie Todd or Dr. Todd Jenkins on LinkedIn. Follow TerraScale to really stay in tune with the next webinar, and as well if you want to review and share this recording. So to all, thank you again for joining us. Thank you for watching and enjoy the rest of your day. Take care.